A Navy SEAL returned to the frozen north to sell what he believed was worthless. An abandoned cave so dark it seemed to swallow the light. But the moment he turned to leave, his German shepherd stepped in front of the entrance, motionless, eyes locked on the blackness inside. Deep within that mountain was more than stone and wind. There was a buried secret and evidence powerful enough to bring down an empire. In a single night, a meaningless inheritance became a battlefield between truth and power. And this time, it wasn't the instinct of a battle-hardened soldier that spoke first. It was the quiet certainty of a dog who refused to walk away. This is not just a story about loyalty. It's about the courage to step into the dark when the world tells you to turn around. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. And help us reach 1,000 subscribers by liking and subscribing. Because every single follow gives us the strength to create even more powerful stories. And now let's begin. The North did not greet a man warmly. It tested him first. Early spring in northern Minnesota was a contradiction of seasons. Sunlight sharp as polished steel. Snow melting in long, wet sighs beneath pine trees. The air cold enough to sting the lungs, while the earth beneath it softened into mud. The lake beyond Gideon Hale's cabin still wore a skin of thinning ice, cracked like a shattered mirror. Gideon stood on the porch with a mug of black coffee he had forgotten to drink. He was 35, 6 foot, built lean and compact, not sculpted for display, but forged for endurance. No beard. Never a beard. His face was always shaved clean, revealing the geometry of discipline. Square jaw, high cheekbones, the kind of bone structure that seemed carved with intent rather than born by chance. His skin was fair, but weathered by cold wind and desert sun alike. His eyes, gray-blue, had the unsettling steadiness of someone who had learned to watch without reacting. His tactical combat shirt, olive faded into gray, hung loose but deliberate on him. The fabric had softened from years of washing and weather. Slight fraying at the cuffs, a pale abrasion across the right shoulder where a rifle sling once rested for too long. Beneath it, the hint of a dark red thermal layer broke the monotony of military tones. His combat pants were worn, but not sloppy. Boots old enough to have memory in them. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Ranger stepped out without invitation. The German shepherd was 6 years old, sable-coated cream, gray and black layered like forest shadows. His body was all function, no excess weight. Ears erect, eyes amber gold and deeply attentive. The black harness he wore was trimmed with a muted dark red, almost the same shade as Gideon's thermal shirt. On a working dog's harness functional, with a top handle worn smooth from use. Ranger did not bark. He rarely did. Instead, he pressed his shoulder lightly against Gideon's thigh. "Morning," Gideon muttered, though it was nearly noon. The phone call had come an hour earlier. A man named Thomas Ellery, attorney at law. Ellery's voice had been thin and precise, the kind that sounded like it had been ironed before speaking. He explained that the man who had once served as Gideon's legal guardian during his years in foster care, Harold Crane, had passed away quietly in his sleep at 78. Harold had left him something, a parcel of land, including a cave. Gideon had said nothing for several seconds. A cave. Not a house, not a savings account. A cave. He had asked for the estimated market value. Minimal, Ellery admitted. The mine was abandoned decades ago. No commercial interest. Gideon had almost laughed. Now, standing in the cold light, he exhaled slowly. Harold Crane had been a quiet man with tobacco-stained fingers and a patience that had once unsettled Gideon more than shouting ever could. He had worked in small-scale mining when he was younger. He had never spoken much about it. He had once told Gideon, "Stone remembers what men try to forget." At 12 years old, Gideon had rolled his eyes. Now he wasn't so sure. Ranger shifted, watching Gideon's face as if it were a weather pattern. "I'm selling it," Gideon said aloud, more to himself than to the dog. He called the number Ellery had provided for a local real estate broker in the town nearest the property. The woman who answered introduced herself as Sarah Whitlock. Her voice carried warmth and fatigue in equal measure. When Gideon later met her in person that afternoon, she matched her voice mid-40s, tall and slightly narrow-shouldered, auburn hair tied in a loose bun at the nape of her neck. Fine lines at the corners of green eyes that suggested years of squinting against wind and sun. She wore jeans, and a thick knit sweater, and a waxed canvas jacket with fraying cuffs. Practical. Unpretentious. She studied him once when he stepped into her office. Not flirtatious. Not intimidated. Just assessing. "You're Crane's boy," she said gently, though Gideon was not anyone's boy anymore. He inclined his head once. She laid out the paperwork, her fingers steady but her eyes curious. "You planning to hold it?" "No." "You haven't seen it?" "I don't need to." Sarah leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. She wasn't confrontational, but there was steel in her spine. "Mr. Hale, people around here say that Cave is worthless, but Harold didn't think so. He bought it with cash he didn't have. I think you owe him at least one look." Gideon's jaw tightened slightly. He did not like owing anyone anything. Outside the office window, Ranger sat beside the truck, motionless, watching the door. Sarah noticed the dog. "That yours?" "Yes." "What's his name?" "Ranger." She nodded, approving. "He looks like he knows things." Gideon allowed the faintest curve of humor at the corner of his mouth. "He does." Sarah slid the paperwork back toward him instead of forward. "Drive up tomorrow," she said. 40 minutes north. If you still want to sell after that, I'll list it." Gideon did not answer immediately. He felt the old reflex, the instinct to cut unnecessary variables, to eliminate sentiment, to move forward efficiently. But Harold Crane's voice echoed faintly in memory. Stone remembers. He signed nothing. "I'll look at it," he said finally. That night, Ranger refused to settle. He paced the cabin in small, deliberate circles, not anxious, focused. At one point, he stopped beside the kitchen counter where the folded topographical map lay. He lowered his head and inhaled deeply at one corner of the paper. Then he sat, still, watching Gideon, not at the man at the map. Gideon's pulse slowed. Ranger had been trained in search and rescue before tactical operations. He responded to scent, to disturbance, to unseen currents in air, but paper held no scent of Cave. And yet the dog's posture shifted ears forward, body angled toward the north-facing window, as if something out there was breathing. Gideon rose slowly and walked to the window. The forest beyond the lake was silent. No headlights, no movement, only pine trees and a sky beginning to cloud. "Easy," he murmured. But Ranger did not relax. He did not bark. He simply stood guard facing north. The direction of the cave. And Gideon, who had not felt curiosity in months, felt it then sharp and unwelcome. He slept lightly that night. The next morning they drove. The truck moved along narrow county roads bordered by thawing fields and stands of birch and pine. The sun was bright, but carried no warmth. Gideon's thoughts remained measured. He had spent most of his adult life making decisions under fire. This was not that. This was paperwork, real estate, closure. And yet his hands on the steering wheel were tighter than necessary. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, head forward, eyes alert. As they turned onto the final gravel road, marked only by a weathered wooden post, the dog's muscles visibly engaged. The property boundary came into view. A rusted metal sign half fallen, Harold Crane's name faintly visible. Beyond it, the land rose gently toward a dark opening at the base of a limestone ridge. The cave. No dramatic shadows, no cinematic mist, just a mouth of stone carved by time. Gideon cut the engine. The silence afterward felt thick. He stepped out, boots crunching over gravel and patches of thawing frost. The air smelled of damp earth and mineral cold. Ranger exited without command, scanning. They approached slowly. The cave entrance was larger than expected, wide enough for two men to walk side by side. Streaks of old mineral runoff marked the walls in pale lines. Gideon paused 10 feet from the opening. He felt something, not fear, not danger, awareness, as if the earth itself had weight beyond geology. He turned slightly, surveying the perimeter. No tire tracks, no recent disturbance that he could see from here. Ranger moved ahead 3 paces, then stopped. His ears snapped forward, his head tilted slightly to the right. He did not growl. He listened. Gideon held still. The wind shifted faintly. There it was. Not wind, not water. A sound so small it could have been imagined. A break in rhythm. A breath that did not belong to stone. Gideon's body shifted without conscious thought. Shoulders squared. Weight forward. "Ranger," he said quietly. The dog's stance changed from alert to focused. There was someone inside. Gideon stepped toward the mouth of the cave, and the north, which had tested him before greeting him, seemed to inhale. The cave swallowed light the way deep water swallowed sound, without malice, without hurry, simply because it could. Gideon Hale paused at the threshold, letting his eyes adjust. The daylight behind him painted the entrance in pale gold, but inside, the air turned colder and older, carrying a metallic tang that reminded him of spent casings and wet stone. It smelled like minerals and memory. Ranger moved first, not charging, not dragging Gideon forward, just gliding with the quiet authority of a creature bred for work and trained for restraint. 6 years old, sable-coated in cream, gray, and black, the German Shepherd's ears stayed upright as if they were antennae tuned to the smallest tremor in the world. His amber eyes tracked the dark, the way Gideon's own eyes tracked corridors, methodical, unblinking, refusing to be fooled. Gideon's boots scraped lightly on the rock. The sound ricocheted and came back distorted, like the cave was imitating him poorly. He didn't like that. He preferred environments that did exactly what they should. He drew a small flashlight from a pouch, thumbed it on, and held it low. The beam cut through dust motes that floated like slow snow. The walls were limestone and old mineral stains, streaked with pale veins that looked like frozen lightning. He listened. Not the listening of a man enjoying nature. The listening of a man who had learned that silence could be a trap. Ranger stopped, nose near the ground. He didn't wag, he didn't whine. He inhaled deep, deliberate, then turned his head slightly to the left, toward a narrower passage branching away from the main mouth. Gideon followed, angling his light. The floor changed there. The thin grit of rock dust gave way to scuffed patches, as if boots had dragged through recently. That's not fresh mud, this was too dry for that. But the kind of disturbance that told him someone had been careful and still failed to erase everything. He crouched, ran 2 fingers across a faint mark, then lifted them to the light. Gray powder. Warmth would have melted snow here if it had been carried in. But it was colder the deeper they went. "Ranger," he murmured, less a command than a check-in. The dog moved again, shoulders rolling in a smooth prowl. The black harness with muted dark red trim hugged his frame snugly, the top handle worn smooth from use. Gideon had gripped that handle in other places with sirens, rotors, shouting places where a dog and a man had to become one decision. This was different. Here, the cave pressed in, close enough to feel like a hand. A bend opened into a shallow chamber. Gideon swept the light across it and stopped. A crumpled tarp lay folded in the corner, not random debris, but deliberate shelter. And a dented metal cup sat beside a flattened cardboard box. A cluster of food cans, labels torn away, stacked with care. A small battery pack, a coil of paracord. Human life reduced to its simplest, most stubborn ingredients. Gideon felt an odd tightness behind his ribs. Not pity. Not exactly. Recognition, maybe. The way a soldier recognized another soldier's fieldcraft. Whoever lived here had been trained by fear. Ranger padded forward and froze. His head lifted. His breathing slowed. His whole posture changed into a stillness so complete it felt like a held breath. Gideon followed the dog's gaze. The flashlight beam landed on a shape that was not stone. A man sat in the shadowed recess of the chamber, knees drawn up, back pressed to the wall like he could dissolve into it. He was in his early 40s, maybe 42, but hard living had carved years into him. His build was lean and drawn, shoulders bony beneath a heavy jacket. His hair brown once, now dulled, was shaggy at the sides. It trimmed unevenly as if cut with impatience. A few days' stubble darkened his jaw, patchy in places where stress had thinned it. His eyes were wide and dark, reflecting the flashlight like an animal caught too suddenly. He held a knife. Not a hunter's confident blade. A shaking one. The kind of weapon meant to keep panic from spilling over. "Don't," the man rasped, voice hoarse from cold air and too many swallowed words. "Don't come closer." Gideon's hand did not reach for his own weapon. He had one, of course, habit and regulation, but he kept both hands visible instead, palms low, body angled so he didn't look like a charging threat. "I'm not here to hurt you," Gideon said. The man's gaze flicked to Ranger. His grip tightened on the knife. Terror made people stupid, but this man's fear had been trained into sharpness. "That dog," he started, then stopped. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. Ranger did something Gideon had not expected. He sat. Right there on the stone, squarely in the line of sight, ears forward, eyes steady. No growl, no teeth. A posture that said, "I see you. I will not chase you. But I will not leave." It was a working dog's calm, the kind that spoke louder than aggression. The man's breathing shuddered, then eased by a fraction. Gideon stayed where he was. He let silence do some of the work. "What's your name?" he asked. The man's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "So I don't have to call you the guy with the knife." A faint, involuntary twitch tugged at the man's mouth, almost a laugh, almost a sob. He looked away quickly, ashamed to have felt anything human. "Marcus," he said at last. "Marcus Rowan." Gideon nodded once. "Gideon." Marcus's eyes snapped back. "Gideon." He hesitated, searching Gideon's face as if digging through a pile of half-burned papers. You're Crane's kid." The words landed heavier than Gideon expected. Harold Crane had been gone only days, and yet hearing his name in the cave made it feel like the old man had left fingerprints on the stone. "How do you know that?" Gideon asked. Marcus swallowed. His knife lowered a little, not fully, but enough to show he was listening rather than striking. "Because Crane was part of this place, before it got forgotten, before people decided it was worthless." Gideon's pulse remained steady. His mind, however, sharpened. "You've been living here." Marcus gave a short nod. "Hiding." "From who?" Marcus's gaze slid toward the darker tunnel behind him, like the answer lived down there. "From the kind of people who make other people disappear and then call it an accident." Gideon had heard that tone before. Not melodrama, not exaggeration. The flat, controlled voice of someone who had learned that speaking too loudly invited punishment. Marcus shifted, and Gideon saw his hands, raw knuckles, cracked skin, the faint tremor of exhaustion. A man who hadn't slept deeply in weeks. "You're not a drifter," Gideon said, more statement than question. Marcus's jaw clenched. "I'm an engineer, geological. I used to work for Whitmore Mining." The name carried local gravity, even if Gideon had never met the people behind it. Companies like that became gods in small towns. People worshipped them because they fed families. People feared them because they could stop. Marcus's eyes hardened with something like shame. "I didn't start out trying to be a hero," he said. "I started out trying to pay my mortgage." Gideon didn't respond with sympathy. He let Marcus speak. "I found documents," Marcus continued, voice still low, still careful. "Survey reports that didn't match what we were filing. Waste logs altered, land use maps redrawn. There's a section near the ridge where—" He stopped, swallowed again. "Where the ground shouldn't be what it is." Gideon's gaze flicked to Ranger. The dog hadn't moved, but his eyes had sharpened, as if the word ridge carried scent. So Marcus took a breath and forced himself onward. "I confronted my supervisor. He smiled at me like I was a child asking why the sky was blue. Then 2 days later, my tires were cut. The day after that, somebody left a note on my porch. No signature, just a message that said, 'Stop digging.'" The irony made Gideon's mouth go dry. "You went to the police?" Gideon asked. Marcus laughed once, humorless. "I tried." He rubbed his face with a shaking hand. One of the deputies, he used to be my fishing buddy. He wouldn't look me in the eye. Told me to let it go for my own good." Gideon felt the familiar anger rise controlled. Quiet. Dangerous. The kind of anger that didn't need volume. Marcus's gaze lifted to Gideon again, cautious hope creeping into the cracks of his fear. "When I heard Crane bought this land, I thought he was just stubborn. Old miner sentimental about old tunnels." He swallowed. "But then I realized this place isn't just a hole in the ground. It's a blind spot. No one comes here. No one cares." Gideon's thoughts moved quickly, assembling a picture. Harold Crane buying a worthless cave with cash he didn't have, leaving it to Gideon. And now Marcus, hiding in it, speaking of falsified maps and threats. The cave was not worthless. It was a secret that had been given a deed. Gideon exhaled slowly. "Do you have proof?" he asked. Marcus's fingers tightened around the knife again, but not with aggression, more like he was gripping the last thing that made him feel real. "Yes," he said. "Not all of it on me, but yes." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "Where?" Marcus's gaze dropped to the floor. "Somewhere dry. Somewhere, even if they find me, they won't find everything." Gideon could respect that. He shifted his weight, careful not to step forward too suddenly. "Listen to me," he said. "I didn't come here looking for you. I came because I inherited this place, and I was going to sell it." Marcus stared at him, disbelief flickering. Gideon continued, voice steady. "But you're here now, which means I have a decision to make." Marcus's throat bobbed. "Please," he said. The word scraped raw. "I don't want to die in a cave. I don't want to die at all. I just—" He stopped, eyes flashing with a grief he couldn't name. "I just wanted to do the right thing once." Something in Gideon's chest loosened and tightened all at once. He thought of Harold Crane's quiet hands, the way the old man had looked at him when Gideon was 14 and furious at the world. Stone remembers what men try to forget. Gideon looked at Ranger. The dog's eyes met his, steady, unreadable, faithful. There was no judgment there, only presence. Only that strange animal certainty that said, "This matters." Gideon spoke again, choosing each word like a step on thin ice. "Put the knife down," he said. "Not because I'm a threat, because I'm not leaving you alone in here." Marcus's hand trembled. His gaze darted to Ranger, and then back to Gideon's face. For a long moment he looked like a man deciding whether belief was more dangerous than fear. Then, slowly, Marcus set the knife on the stone beside him. The sound it made, metal tapping rock, echoed softly, like a bell rung in a place that rarely heard truth. As Marcus's fingers released the knife, Ranger rose from his sit with quiet grace and took a single step forward close enough to bridge distance, far enough to respect it. Marcus flinched anyway. Ranger stopped instantly, then did something almost unnervingly gentle. He lowered his head and nudged the airknot Marcus's hand, not his knee, just the space between them, as if testing whether trust had a scent. Marcus's face tightened. His eyes glistened, and Gideon realized the man wasn't just afraid of being killed. He was afraid of being seen. Marcus whispered, barely audible. He acts like he knows me." Gideon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave. Ranger did not behave like this with strangers. Not usually. Not unless there was something familiar in the air, something tied to old paths, old searches, old grief. For a heartbeat, Gideon imagined the cave as a courtroom, and the dog as its witness, silent, incorruptible, unable to be bribed. A creature that remembered not by story, but by scent and instinct. And Gideon, who had built his life on evidence and angles and extraction routes, found himself wondering if justice sometimes arrived on 4 paws. The thought did not make him softer. It made him sharper. Gideon kept his voice level. "How long have you been here?" Marcus blinked, wiping at his face with the heel of his hand as if ashamed of moisture. "Long enough that my body doesn't know what day it is," he said. 2 weeks, maybe 3. "Food?" "I ration." "Water?" Marcus pointed toward a narrow crack in the wall, where a slow drip gathered in a small, carved depression. "That," he said, "and snowmelt when I can catch it near the mouth." Gideon's eyes flicked to the crack, then back to Marcus. "You can't stay," he said. Marcus's jaw tightened. "I can't leave." "Then we figure out a third option," Gideon replied. A dry, almost hysterical laugh escaped Marcus. "You sound like you've never been trapped before." Gideon didn't smile. "I have." He didn't add, "Trapped isn't always a physical thing." Ranger moved to the side of the chamber and sniffed the scattered supplies. He nosed a torn label. He checked the tarp. He circled once, then returned to Gideon's flank as if reporting. "Nothing immediately dangerous, but the situation is thin." Gideon's mind ran logistics. He had no cell signal this deep. He wasn't sure about the stability of the cave beyond what he could see. He had a vehicle outside, a broker who expected him back, and an entire legal mess he had walked into with the arrogance of a man who thought paperwork couldn't bleed. He looked at Marcus. "You said Whitmore Mining," Gideon said. "What exactly did you find?" Marcus hesitated, then reached into his jacket slowly, careful to keep movements non-threatening. He pulled out a sealed plastic sleeve, water-spotted but intact. Inside was a folded photocopy of a map and a page of typed text with highlighted sections. Even in dim light, Gideon could see the markings, revised land boundaries, annotations, a block of numbers that looked like coordinates. Marcus held it out with 2 fingers, like offering a relic. "I kept one piece on me," he said, "in case I didn't get a chance to tell anyone." Gideon took it carefully, the way he would take a fragile detonator or a newborn animal. He angled his flashlight. The paper wasn't proof of murder, but it was proof of lying. And lying, Gideon knew, was often the first blood in the snow. He folded the sleeve and handed it back. "We're going to get you out," he said, voice low. "Not today, not like this. But soon." Marcus stared at him as if Gideon had offered him a language he had forgotten. "Why?" he asked. Gideon's eyes drifted briefly, uninvited, toward the cave wall. Toward the weight of stone that Harold Crane had once loved enough to buy. Then he looked at Ranger, who stood steady at his side, the embodiment of loyalty that didn't require explanations. "Because somebody tried to make you disappear," Gideon said. "And I don't like unfinished stories." Marcus's shoulders sagged, relief and dread mixing into one trembling exhale. The cave remained silent around them, but the silence felt different now, not empty. Occupied. Gideon turned his flashlight toward the passageway back to the entrance. "Can you walk?" he asked. Marcus nodded, though his legs shook as he unfolded himself from the rock. Ranger moved closer, ready not to attack, but to steady the moment if it fell. Gideon led them toward the mouth of the cave, and toward the strip of daylight that waited like a thin promise. He didn't know yet what the cave truly held, but he knew what it had already done. It had handed him a human life when he had come looking for a signature line. And that, he realized, was how fate liked to joke quietly, precisely, with no regard for a man's plans. They did not leave the cave immediately. Gideon had learned long ago that urgency could kill more efficiently than hesitation. He motioned Marcus to sit again, though not in the same hollow where fear had pinned him. Closer to the mouth now, closer to light. The air near the entrance felt thinner, edged with the scent of thawing earth and pine sap drifting in from outside. It was still cold, but it carried movement. Inside the deeper chamber, the cold had been stagnant, like a held breath. Marcus moved stiffly, legs unsteady from weeks of confinement. Up close, Gideon could see how hunger had carved at him. His cheekbones were sharper than they should have been. His eyes, dark brown, almost black in the dimness, had the glassy sheen of a man who slept in fragments and trusted nothing longer than a minute. Ranger stayed between them at first. Not in hostility, but in alignment. The dog's presence was deliberate, like a bridge no one had asked for, but both needed. "You said they might find you," Gideon said quietly. "How?" Marcus ran a hand through his uneven hair, fingers trembling from cold and fatigue. "Because I made a mistake." He let out a long breath, and with it the practiced composure he had been clinging to. "I sent an email," he said. Gideon's jaw tightened slightly. "To who?" "A federal contact. Someone who used to do contract audits for mining compliance. His name is Daniel Ortiz." Marcus swallowed before continuing. "I encrypted what I could. Attached partial scans. Not everything. I thought if something happened to me, at least the information would reach someone outside the county." Gideon didn't interrupt. But Whitmore Mining has internal IT teams monitoring outgoing communication, Marcus went on. I underestimated how fast they'd trace anomalies. As they couldn't break the encryption fully, but they traced the origin tower. He looked toward the cave wall, as if the limestone might respond. I shut off my phone right after. Drove north, paid cash for gas, ditched the car near a logging road. But I had to leave the cave twice for supplies. Small town. Cameras everywhere now. Even in places that pretend they still live in 1998. Gideon pictured it clearly. Grainy footage, a license plate, a pattern forming under someone else's watchful eye. They don't need to know exactly where I am, Marcus said. They just need to know I'm still alive. Outside the cave, the wind shifted, carrying a faint rustle of tree branches. Gideon rose slowly and stepped toward the entrance, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. But nothing moved too perfectly. The forest was the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears. Marcus followed his gaze. You think they're already here? I think if they've narrowed the area, Gideon said, they won't send a convoy. They'll send 2 men, maybe 3. Quiet. Marcus's shoulders tightened. They're not killers, he said quickly, as if defending something fragile. Not officially. They're problem solvers. Problem solvers kill too, Gideon replied evenly. Marcus flinched at the calm certainty in his voice. Gideon stepped back into the cave and crouched near Marcus. You said you have more than that page, he said. Marcus nodded. Not here. I split it. Some with a journalist contact, some encrypted on a drive. Hidden. Where? Marcus hesitated. Ranger shifted his weight, eyes moving between the 2 men. Gideon held Marcus's gaze. If I'm going to get you out, he said quietly, I need to know what we're protecting. Marcus stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether survival required trust or solitude. Finally, he said, There's a secondary survey shaft beyond the ridge. Abandoned. I hid a waterproof case there, sealed in a crevice behind old reinforcement beams. Gideon nodded once. And that meant 2 objectives now. Marcus and the evidence. The cave felt smaller. A thin vibration hummed faintly through the stone beneath Gideon's boots. At first he thought it was imagination. Then Ranger's ears snapped upright. The dog pivoted toward the entrance. He did not bark. He did not growl. He froze. Gideon felt it then. A low mechanical tremor. Subtle, but unmistakable. An engine. Far enough to be cautious. Close enough to matter. Marcus's breath hitched. They found the road, he whispered. Gideon stood and moved to the entrance, keeping low against the stone. Through the break in trees, a faint glint of reflected light flickered metal, catching sun for a fraction of a second. Not a logging truck. Too still. Too deliberate. He returned inside, expression unchanged, but sharper. They're scouting, he said. Marcus's hands trembled harder now. If they see the truck... They won't, Gideon cut in. I parked beyond the bend, out of direct line of sight. He paused. They're not here yet, he added, but they're close. Marcus pressed his palms against his eyes, fighting panic. I didn't mean to drag you into this, he said hoarsely. Gideon's voice was steady. You didn't drag me. He thought of Harold Crane again, of the old miner's stubbornness, of the unexplained purchase of land that had never produced profit. Maybe Crane had known something. Maybe he had sensed that this cave was not an investment, but a safeguard. As the low engine noise faded, Ranger did something that made Gideon's breath stall. Instead of staying near Marcus, instead of guarding the entrance, the dog turned and trotted deeper into the cave, past the makeshift shelter, past the drip of water Marcus had relied on. He moved with intent. Gideon followed without question. The narrow passage sloped downward slightly before widening into a low alcove Gideon had not yet explored. Os Ranger stopped at a section of wall where old timber supports jutted from the limestone relics from early mining reinforcement. The wood was splintered, aged to a grayish-brown, half-rotted but still standing. Ranger lowered his head and inhaled deeply. Then he pawed once at the ground near the base of the beam. Gideon's pulse quickened. He knelt and brushed aside loose gravel. Underneath, the dirt looked recently disturbed, subtle, but real. Marcus appeared behind them, confusion and dawning recognition colliding in his expression. "I didn't hide anything here," he said. Gideon kept digging lightly with his hands. He unearthed a fragment of plastic, thin, translucent, embedded in the soil. Not a full case, not a clear object, just a piece. Ranger sat back on his haunches, watching the earth as if expecting it to speak. Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper. "That's not mine." For a moment, Gideon felt something colder than the cave air. If Marcus hadn't hidden anything here, then someone else had. The implication lingered like frost on skin. Gideon covered the fragment back with dirt deliberately. Not panic, not reaction, information. He rose slowly and met Marcus's eyes. "You're not the only one using this place," he said. The words settled heavily between them. Ranger returned to Gideon's side, posture calm but alert. Whatever the cave had once been, mine, shelter, secret, it had layers neither of them had fully seen. The engine noise outside did not return, but the silence now carried weight. They moved back toward the entrance cautiously. Gideon calculated timing. If the scouts were circling, they would likely pass the ridgeline again before retreating. If they were methodical, they'd avoid obvious confrontation. This was reconnaissance, not retrieval. Marcus leaned against the wall near the light, eyes fixed on the tree line. "If they get the rest of it," he said, voice tight, "it won't just disappear. It'll be rewritten." Gideon understood that too well. He thought of falsified reports, altered boundaries, quiet approvals stamped in ink. "Tell me about Whitmore," he said. Marcus exhaled slowly. "Caleb Whitmore," he said. "Vice president. Tall. Immaculate. Silver hair combed back like he doesn't trust gravity. Always wears charcoal coats even when it's not cold. He grew up in this county. His father ran the company before him." Marcus's voice softened slightly, complicated by reluctant respect. He genuinely believes he's protecting the town. That without the mine, people lose jobs. That sometimes numbers need to shift to keep families fed. Gideon studied Marcus carefully. "And you?" Marcus looked at his own hands, cracked and dirty. "I believed that too," he admitted. "Until the land survey didn't just shift numbers. It shifted ground." The wind outside grew louder briefly, pushing cold air into the cave mouth. Gideon felt the pressure of decisions forming. "We can't move you today," he said. "Not with them scouting. We need a window." Marcus nodded slowly. "And the drive?" Gideon asked. "Still safe," Marcus said. "I didn't bring it here." Good. Gideon looked once more at the tree line beyond the entrance. The world outside looked ordinary. Too ordinary. He felt the weight of the cave behind him, stone layered over older stone, secrets pressed into sediment. He had come here intending to sell it. Instead, he had inherited a battleground that did not use bullets. Ranger shifted beside him, tail low but steady. Gideon rested a hand briefly on the dog's harness. "We leave at dusk," he said quietly. Marcus's breath trembled. "And if they're still out there?" "Then we move smarter," Gideon replied. The cave did not answer, but the silence felt watchful now, as if the stone itself were listening to the choices being made within it. Gideon stepped back into shadow, already mapping routes in his mind. Above them, the north remained bright and indifferent. Inside, the cave held its breath. Dusk did not fall in the north. It stretched. The light outside the cave thinned slowly, turning from sharp silver to muted blue. Pine shadows lengthened across the clearing like dark fingers reaching inward. Gideon watched the tree line from the edge of the entrance, every sense extended but controlled. Marcus sat against the rock wall near the mouth, no longer hidden in the deepest shadow, but not fully exposed either. His exhaustion showed differently now, not as panic, but as resignation layered over stubborn endurance. He rubbed his wrists absently, as if the air itself had been restraining him. Ranger lay low at Gideon's left side, chin resting between his paws, but eyes never closing. His sable coat blended into the dim cave floor, only the faint glint in his amber eyes giving him away. Was the harness strap across his back caught the last of the light and faded with it. "They're patient," Marcus murmured, staring outward. "Whitmore doesn't hire reckless men." Gideon said nothing. He listened instead. No engine hum now, no obvious movement, just wind-brushing pine needles, distant crows shifting on branches, but still too measured, too expectant. "We move when visibility drops enough to blur distance," Gideon said finally. "But before full dark." Marcus nodded. "You know this kind of waiting." "Yes." He didn't elaborate. The cave behind them breathed cold against their backs. The temperature was falling quickly. Meltwater dripped somewhere deeper inside, steady and indifferent. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "If they enter," he asked quietly, "what happens?" Gideon's gaze remained fixed outward. "They won't announce themselves." "That's not what I meant." Gideon finally looked at him. "If they enter," he said evenly, "they won't expect resistance from someone they think is half-starved and desperate." Marcus's lips pressed thin. "And from someone like you?" he asked. Gideon didn't answer that. The first sign came not from sound, but from Ranger. The dog's posture changed. Not alarm, not aggression, calculation. His head lifted slightly, his ears angled, not toward the tree line, but slightly above it. Gideon followed that angle with his eyes. Then he saw it. A faint flicker, barely perceptible on the ridge slope beyond the clearing. Not a full beam, just a quick flash of reflected light, as if someone had adjusted binoculars or a scope too quickly. Marcus stiffened. "They're closer than I thought," he whispered. Gideon's jaw tightened. "Inside," he said softly. They retreated 2 steps deeper into the cave, keeping a visual line to the entrance but reducing their silhouette. The air felt denser now, and then the forest made a mistake. A branch snapped, not loud, not careless, but wrong. Ranger rose silently, muscles tightening beneath his coat. 2 figures emerged at the edge of the clearing. They moved with deliberate calm, men trained not in combat necessarily, but in quiet retrieval. Dark jackets, neutral colors. No obvious insignia. One taller, broad-shouldered, with a thick neck and shaved head that caught what little light remained. The other leaner, with a short beard trimmed close along a sharp jawline. He carried himself with an accountant's posture measured, efficient, emotionally absent. They didn't rush the cave. They studied it. Gideon lowered his voice to a whisper. "They're assessing." Marcus's breathing grew shallow. The taller man stepped forward first, boots crunching softly on gravel. He scanned the entrance, eyes calculating angles and shadow depth. His face was impassive, not cruel, not expressive. Just a professional. The second man spoke quietly, too far to hear words. They didn't draw weapons. That told Gideon something. They wanted confirmation first. They approached the mouth of the cave slowly. Ranger did not growl. He waited. Gideon shifted his stance, body angled slightly, weight balanced. The taller man stepped into the cave's outer threshold. "Marcus!" he called evenly. His voice carried calm authority. Not shouting, not threatening, just claiming. Marcus flinched visibly. The second man remained outside, scanning perimeter lines. His gaze swept the tree line, then the rock wall above the entrance. "Marcus Rowan," the taller man continued, "you're making this more complicated than it needs to be." Gideon remained just out of full view, shadow partially concealing him. Marcus's fingers curled against the rock. "You don't have to live like this," the man said. "We can talk." Gideon's pulse slowed rather than quickened. They were trying to coax, not force. Yet. The taller man took another step inward. That was when Ranger moved. Not with sound. Not with bark. He stepped into the narrow beam of fading light, placing himself between Marcus and the man. And the movement was precise and controlled. The man stopped immediately. His eyes dropped to the dog. "That's new," he said quietly. Gideon stepped forward just enough for his outline to register. The man's gaze rose, met Gideon's eyes. There was a flicker of recalculation. "Didn't expect company," he said. "Private property," Gideon replied calmly. The second man stepped just inside the entrance now, positioning slightly behind his partner. The air tightened. "No one's here to escalate," the taller man said. "We're here to ensure Mr. Rowan's safety." Marcus let out a short, broken laugh from behind Ranger. "That's rich," he muttered. Gideon held the man's gaze. "If you were concerned about his safety," he said evenly, "you wouldn't be approaching him in the dark." The taller man studied him carefully. "Who are you?" he asked. "Owner." A pause. The second man shifted slightly, boots scraping stone. And then the cave answered. What a low cracking sound rippled through the ceiling above them. Subtle, but unmistakable. Everyone froze. The thaw. Water had been seeping into fractures for weeks. Freeze and thaw cycles stressed old support beams. The taller man glanced upward instinctively. Wrong move. Ranger lunged not to bite, but to drive. He surged forward in a burst of force, body slamming into the man's legs with controlled power. Not attack displacement. The man stumbled backward out of the cave mouth just as a section of weakened limestone broke loose. The collapse wasn't catastrophic, but it was violent enough. Rock slammed down between the entrance and the chamber, sending a burst of dust and stone shards outward. A support beam cracked and snapped, one end splintering against the ground. The second man leapt backward, dragging his partner clear. Gideon grabbed Marcus by the collar and yanked him deeper into the cave as debris sprayed inward. The sound was thunderous in confined space. Dust filled the air. A ranger retreated immediately to Gideon's side. The entrance was partially blocked, now jagged stone, and fallen timber narrowing the opening by half. Silence followed, broken only by settling gravel. Outside, one of the men coughed violently. "Back off!" the second man snapped. They stumbled several paces away from the entrance. The taller man regained his footing, brushing dust from his jacket. He looked shaken, but not broken. He stared at the collapse with narrowed eyes. "That was predictable," he muttered. Gideon studied the new terrain quickly. The main entrance was compromised, but not sealed. More importantly, it had created obstruction. A choke point. Marcus's voice trembled beside him. "Did they do that?" "No," Gideon said quietly. "The mountain did." Outside, the two men conferred briefly in low tones. They were not equipped for excavation. They had come for retrieval, not rescue. The taller man looked back toward the cave. His eyes met Gideon's across the debris. "Enjoy the evening," he called evenly. Then he turned. Both men retreated toward the tree line. Their footsteps faded. Only wind remained. Dust still hung thick in the air when Ranger did something unexpected. Instead of focusing on the partially blocked entrance, instead of guarding the direction the men had fled, he turned sharply toward the interior wall, toward the deeper darkness beyond Marcus's former shelter. He stepped forward cautiously and lowered his nose to the ground. Then he gave a low, uncertain huff. Not alarm. Recognition. Gideon's spine tightened. The collapse had shifted more than stone. Small pebbles rolled from somewhere farther inside the cave, somewhere that had not been touched by the falling rock, as if something else had moved. Marcus's eyes widened. "There's no one else," he whispered. But Ranger did not retreat. He stared into the deeper passage, ears angled, muscles coiled, not toward threat from outside, but from within. For a long moment, the cave felt less like shelter and more like a layered archive of decisions made long before either of them arrived. Then the sound stopped. The stillness returned. Ranger relaxed by degrees, though his gaze lingered. Gideon exhaled slowly. The cave had intervened, and in doing so, it had changed the terrain of everything. Marcus slid down the wall until he was sitting again, shaking from adrenaline rather than cold. "They'll come back," he said quietly. "Yes," Gideon agreed. "But not tonight." The collapse had spooked them. It introduced variables they hadn't calculated. Gideon stepped toward the narrowed entrance, assessing structural integrity. They could still pass through single file. The debris provided partial concealment. "It bought us time," he said. Marcus looked at him with something that wasn't quite relief. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Gideon's mind was already mapping. "They expected compliance," he said. "They didn't expect interference. But now they know you're not alone." Marcus swallowed. "That makes it worse." "Not necessarily." Ranger returned to Gideon's side, posture alert but steady. Gideon rested a hand briefly on the harness. "The collapse changes the equation," he said quietly. Marcus looked toward the dark interior, then back toward the blocked mouth. "For better?" he asked. Gideon didn't answer immediately. He studied the jagged stone, the fractured beam, the dust settling in faint golden streaks. "For different," he said at last. The cave had tested them, and for the moment it had chosen not to bury them. The dust settled slowly, like snow reconsidering where it wanted to land. For several seconds after the collapse, no one moved. The cave seemed to listen to itself, testing its own weight. Small fragments continued to trickle down from fractured edges, clicking softly against the stone floor. Gideon waited. He had learned that in unstable terrain, the first instinct to rush, to check, to react, often invited the second collapse. Ranger stood rigid at his side, sable coat dusted pale with limestone powder. His ears flicked once toward the entrance, then back toward Gideon. The dog's breathing remained even. Alert, not panicked. Marcus was shaking, not dramatically, not theatrically, but his fingers trembled where they pressed against his knees. He was 42, but in that moment he looked younger and older at once, like a man whose body had aged faster than his will. "They'll think it was us," Marcus said, voice thin. "No," Gideon replied. "They'll think it was the thaw." Marcus swallowed. "They won't like unpredictability." "Neither do I." Gideon moved toward the partially blocked entrance and crouched to assess the debris. The limestone slab that had fallen was angled rather than flush-heavy, but not immovable. The snapped timber beam lay at an incline, one end wedged against stone. The passage was narrowed to single-file movement. It was not sealed, but it was changed. He ran his hand lightly across the fractured edge, feeling vibration through fingertips. Stable for now. Behind him, Marcus stood slowly. "We should leave," he said, "before they regroup." Gideon didn't answer immediately. He was calculating more than timing. He was calculating human nature. Men like the ones outside didn't panic. They adjusted. They would withdraw, report, reassess, and then they would return better prepared. "We leave," Gideon said at last, "but not straight down the road." Marcus frowned faintly. "What do you mean?" "There's a secondary survey shaft beyond the ridge," Gideon said, recalling Marcus's earlier confession. "You said you hid part of the evidence there." Marcus stiffened. "Yes." "We don't go to the truck," Gideon continued. "We move through the back slope and circle wide." Marcus hesitated. "That terrain is unstable," he said. "Old supports. Partial cave-ins." Gideon stood and faced him fully. "So is this one," he replied. Marcus met his eyes. There was fear there, but also something else now. Decision. Gideon glanced at Ranger. The dog shifted closer, ready. They began moving deeper into the cave, toward the passage that sloped subtly downward before bending left. The air cooled further with each step. The scent of mineral water grew stronger. Their footfalls were quiet, but not silent boots scraping lightly against damp stone. Marcus walked slightly behind Gideon now, no longer hiding in corners. His breathing steadied as movement replaced waiting. Gideon's mind remained alert to every detail: airflow direction, floor stability, echoes that didn't match their rhythm. Halfway down the passage, Ranger slowed. He lowered his nose to the ground again, inhaling deeply. Gideon stopped instantly. "What?" Marcus whispered. Ranger stepped forward 3 paces, then halted near a narrow fissure in the rock wall. He sniffed the air, not the ground this time. Gideon approached cautiously. The fissure was barely shoulder-wide but extended upward in a jagged seam. Cool air moved through it. Fresh air. Marcus blinked. That wasn't open before. Gideon studied the fracture. It looked older than today's collapse, but recently widened. Water had eaten at it over time. The tremor from the falling slab may have loosened it further. He angled his flashlight into the crack. Beyond it, faintly visible, was darkness that did not belong to the current chamber. A side route. Marcus shook his head slowly. "I didn't know about that." Gideon's expression did not change. "You don't know this cave as well as you thought." Ranger did something then that neither man expected. Instead of squeezing into the fissure or stepping back, he sat directly in front of it and looked at Gideon. Not outward, not toward Marcus. At him. His amber eyes held steady, calm, intent. Gideon felt a memory rise unbidden. A different tunnel, a collapsed corridor overseas. A young private pinned under concrete, whispering through dust. Ranger had done the same thing then, sat and waited, refusing to move until Gideon trusted what he couldn't yet see. "Trust the air," the dog had once seemed to say. "Trust what you feel, not what you fear." Gideon inhaled slowly. The air through the fissure was cleaner than the chamber behind them. That meant connection to open space. It also meant structural weakness. The cave had not just changed, it had offered them an option. Marcus's voice trembled. "We don't have time to explore new passages." "We don't have time not to." Gideon replied quietly. The dog did not blink. The silence pressed. Then Gideon nodded once. We check it. They moved carefully. Gideon went first, angling his shoulders to slip through the crack. The stone scraped lightly against his tactical shirt, catching on a frayed cuff. The red thermal beneath flashed briefly in the dim light, before disappearing into shadow. Ranger followed smoothly, harness brushing rock but not snagging. Marcus hesitated, then squeezed through, breath shallow. On the other side, the space widened unexpectedly into a lower tunnel that sloped upward at a gradual incline. The floor was uneven, but dry. Gideon swept his light across old tool marks in the rock primitive chisel lines from decades past. This connects to the old reinforcement corridor, Marcus whispered, recognition dawning. Miners used to test secondary seams there. Gideon nodded. And from there? He asked. Marcus swallowed. There's an exit vent near the ridge. Large enough? For airflow, Marcus said. Maybe for a man. Gideon's mind adjusted instantly. The main entrance was compromised and likely monitored soon. This was an unknown route. Unknown meant risk. Unknown also meant opportunity. They moved upward slowly. The incline forced Marcus to brace against the wall occasionally. His legs were weaker than he admitted. You good? Gideon asked without turning. Marcus nodded. I can walk. Ranger glanced back at him once, as if verifying the statement. Halfway up the tunnel, a distant rumble vibrated faintly through the stone. Not collapse. Engine. Closer this time. Gideon stopped. They're back, Marcus whispered. Probably, Gideon agreed. But they weren't at the main entrance now. They were beneath the ridge. The rumble faded, then returned in a different direction. They were repositioning. Gideon felt a brief surge of satisfaction. They expected the original approach. They would not anticipate this route so quickly. The tunnel narrowed again near the top. Light, very faint, filtered down through a small opening above. The exit vent. Gideon examined it carefully. It was not designed for human passage, but erosion had widened it. He removed his gloves and tested the rock edge. It crumbled slightly beneath pressure. Help me, he said. Marcus joined him, pushing loose fragments away carefully, widening the opening just enough. Cold air rushed in. Outside smelled like pine and wet soil. Ranger stood below, eyes fixed upward, waiting. Gideon climbed first, gripping natural handholds carved by time. His boots found stable purchase. He pulled himself through the opening and rolled onto damp ground. The ridgeline was sparse, low brush. Thin trees, patches of exposed rock. He scanned the horizon instantly, through a break in trees below, and he spotted the same dark vehicle parked near the original road access. Two figures stood beside it. They were watching the cave entrance, not the ridge. Gideon lowered himself slightly and signaled down. Marcus emerged next. Awkward but determined, his jacket snagged briefly before he freed it. Ranger leapt lightly and landed beside Gideon with controlled grace. They crouched low behind brush. Marcus stared down at the men below. They're waiting, he whispered. Yes. For me. Gideon's eyes moved across terrain. We move parallel to the ridge, he said. Then drop into the gully beyond that pine cluster. It'll break visual line. Marcus nodded slowly. Fear still lived in him, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was directional. They began moving. Each step measured. Each breath controlled. Behind them, the cave remained silent, its main entrance guarded, its new passage concealed. Gideon felt the shift inside himself. He had come intending to close a chapter of his life cell land. Sign papers, walk away. Instead, he was maneuvering through terrain not as a soldier, but as a guardian of something fragile. He glanced at Ranger briefly. The dog moved with effortless focus, body low, scanning constantly. There was no doubt in him, no second guessing, only presence. They reached the gully and descended carefully, using tree roots for balance. The ridge shielded them from sight. Below, meltwater trickled through shallow channels, reflecting pale sky. Marcus stumbled once, but regained footing quickly. They paused beneath dense pine cover. From here, the dark vehicle was no longer visible. Marcus exhaled shakily. "They'll search the entrance," he said. "Yes. And they won't find me. Not tonight." Marcus looked at Gideon fully for the first time without panic in his eyes. "You didn't have to do this," he said. Gideon studied the horizon. "I know," he replied. The engine below started again. The vehicle repositioned closer to the cave mouth, as they were committing to the obvious path. Gideon adjusted his stance. "We keep moving," he said. Marcus nodded. Ranger stepped forward, already anticipating the direction. Behind them, the ridge held its silence. The collapse had altered the front door. The mountain had opened another. And for now, that was enough. They moved for nearly an hour beneath the shelter of pine and ridge shadow before Gideon allowed them to slow. The northern forest at night did not feel empty. It felt observant. Snowmelt slid quietly through shallow cuts in the earth. Wind threaded through evergreen branches with a low, whispering persistence. The sky had deepened into indigo, the last smear of light fading behind the tree line. Marcus walked beside him now instead of behind. Not because he was less afraid, because he understood fear differently. The gully had curved west before bending south again, giving them distance from the cave's direct approach. Gideon knew the land was open pasture beyond the tree line further down, so he kept them within cover as long as possible. Ranger moved slightly ahead, sable coat nearly dissolving into shadow. His gait was fluid, and deliberate, no wasted movement. 6 years old and still carrying the discipline of structured training, yet softened by something deeper now. Intuition. His ears pivoted constantly, triangulating sound with quiet efficiency. Marcus broke the silence first. "There's a service road up ahead," he said quietly. "It runs behind the ridge. Logging trucks use it seasonally." "Monitored?" Gideon asked. "Not officially." "Unofficially." Marcus hesitated. "Whitmore owns most of the access easements," he admitted. Gideon nodded once. Ownership did not always mean control, but it often meant influence. They reached the edge of the service road just as headlights flared in the distance. Gideon motioned Marcus down immediately. They crouched low behind brush. The vehicle approaching was not the dark retrieval SUV from earlier. This one was cleaner, white, corporate. It moved slowly, not searching arriving. The truck stopped near a bend where the ridgeline dipped. The engine cut. A man stepped out. Even from a distance, his posture carried authority that did not need to announce itself. Caleb Whitmore. Marcus's breath caught. "You're sure?" Gideon asked quietly. Marcus nodded once, jaw tight. Caleb Whitmore stood tall, mid-50s, silver hair combed back with meticulous precision. Even in field conditions, he wore a tailored charcoal coat over a dark sweater, collar sharp, cuffs immaculate. He moved like a man who expected the ground to respect him. He surveyed the ridge calmly. Not hurried, not frantic, just calculating. Another man stepped from the driver's side, a younger assistant, early 30s perhaps, narrow face, pale skin, hair cropped too neatly to be accidental. His eyes darted more frequently, scanning perimeter with the nervous loyalty of someone who had risen quickly and feared falling. Whitmore said something quietly to him. The assistant nodded and retreated toward the vehicle, retrieving something from the back. Binoculars. Whitmore lifted them slowly and scanned the ridge. Gideon lowered his profile instinctively. Ranger remained still as stone. Marcus whispered, barely audible. He doesn't get involved personally, unless it matters. Gideon studied Whitmore's silhouette. There was no visible rage, no open malice, just a man assessing damage control. Stay down, Gideon murmured. Whitmore lowered the binoculars and began walking up the ridge path, not toward the cave entrance, but toward elevation, toward the vantage point they had recently used. Gideon felt a slow tightening in his chest. He wasn't chasing. He was verifying. Marcus's hands trembled again. He'll think I ran, he whispered. Good, Gideon replied quietly. Whitmore reached a flat outcropping halfway up the ridge and paused. He stood there, looking outward not directly at the cave now, but at the forest, at possibility, at roots. Gideon watched the man's face through a narrow gap in brush. Up close, Yabos Whitmore's features were composed, but not cold. Lines at the edges of his eyes spoke of long years making hard choices. His jaw was firm, clean-shaven, and set in habitual restraint. There was conviction there. That made him more dangerous. The assistant climbed up behind him. Sir, the younger man said softly, voice carrying faintly on the wind. Structural assessment indicates partial collapse at the primary access. Whitmore nodded once. Stability? He asked. Temporary. We'd need equipment to clear it safely. Whitmore exhaled slowly. And Rowan? Unconfirmed. Whitmore's gaze shifted subtly toward the tree line. Alive, he said quietly. The certainty in his voice made Marcus stiffen. How does he know? Marcus whispered. Gideon did not answer. Whitmore continued scanning for a moment longer before speaking again. He's not reckless, Whitmore said to his assistant. He's frightened. That makes him cautious. The assistant shifted uneasily. And if he reaches outside counsel? Whitmore lowered the binoculars. He won't, he said calmly. Because he doesn't trust anyone. Marcus flinched as if struck. Gideon felt something shift inside him then. Whitmore was not guessing. He was profiling. And he was accurate. Ranger's head tilted slightly, not toward Whitmore, not toward the assistant, but toward Gideon. For a brief, suspended second, the world narrowed to that gaze. Amber eyes steady, not alerting, not warning, anchoring. Gideon felt the weight of the moment settle into him. Whitmore believed Marcus trusted no one. He believed isolation was Marcus's weakness. Gideon understood something then that Whitmore did not. Trust, once given, did not fracture easily. Ranger did not calculate loyalty. He lived it. And in that simple, unwavering presence, Gideon felt the outline of a different strategy forming. Not based on fear, not based on flight, but on exposure. He looked back at Whitmore. The mountain may belong to him, Gideon thought, but the truth does not. The thought settled quietly. Not as bravado, as resolve. Whitmore turned at last and began descending the ridge. The assistant followed closely. They returned to the white truck. Before entering, Whitmore paused and glanced once more toward the forest. His expression did not change, but something in his posture hardened, just slightly. Then he got in. The engine started. The truck rolled away slowly, headlights cutting through early night. Marcus exhaled shakily. He'll escalate, he said. Yes, Gideon agreed. He won't stop. I know. Marcus's voice cracked. I never wanted to fight him, he whispered. He helped fund the school my sister teaches at. He rebuilt the old bridge after the flood. He's not a villain. Gideon studied the dark road where the truck had disappeared. Most men aren't, he said quietly. Ranger rose and began moving again, sensing shift in tension. But they remained crouched for several minutes after the truck vanished, ensuring no secondary surveillance lingered. Then Gideon stood. "We go now," he said. "To the survey shaft?" Marcus asked. "Yes." Marcus nodded. Fear remained in him, but it was no longer solitary. They moved deeper along the ridge, descending gradually toward the area Marcus had described earlier. The forest grew thicker here. Tree roots twisted like veins across the ground. The air smelled of cold water and sap. After 20 minutes, Marcus slowed. "It's near here," he said quietly. Gideon signaled halt. Ranger began scanning ground scent. Marcus stepped carefully toward a cluster of fallen timber beams partially buried beneath brush. They were remnants of old reinforcement structures, long abandoned. He knelt and began clearing debris with shaking hands. Gideon crouched beside him and helped. They uncovered a narrow crevice between two angled stones. Marcus reached in and withdrew a waterproof case, scuffed, mud-streaked, but intact. His breath left him in a long exhale. "It's still here," he said softly. Gideon took the case and weighed it in his hand. Heavy enough. Marcus looked up at him. "What now?" he asked. Gideon's gaze shifted toward the distant road where Whitmore had stood earlier. Now the mountain belonged to no one. Only stone and silence. "We don't run," Gideon said quietly. Marcus blinked. "We document," Gideon continued. "We preserve. We choose where and when this surfaces." Marcus stared at him. "You're serious?" "Yes." Ranger stood between them, steady and grounded. The night deepened around them. The ridge loomed silent behind. Whitmore believed fear would drive this to ground. But Gideon had seen something else. The mountain had chosen its witnesses, and the evidence was now in his hands. Night had settled fully by the time they reached Gideon's cabin. The lake stretched dark and still beneath a thin skin of thawing ice, reflecting scattered stars like quiet witnesses. The cabin lights were off. Gideon preferred the house to breathe in shadow. No glow to announce presence, no silhouette framed in windows, just timber, pine, and cold air layered with the scent of wet earth. Marcus paused on the porch before stepping inside, eyes scanning the perimeter instinctively. Weeks in hiding had reshaped his posture. He moved like a man who expected interruption, shoulders slightly drawn, gaze never resting too long in one place. Ranger entered first, sable coat dim against the wooden floor, amber eyes sweeping corners, confirming absence of threat before lowering his tail and shifting from guard to companion. As the cabin's interior was spare-scarred wooden table, two sturdy chairs, a cast-iron stove radiating low warmth, walls bare except for a single mounted shelf. Order without ornament. Gideon set the waterproof case on the table. Under lamplight, it looked less like evidence and more like consequence. Marcus stood opposite him, brown hair still uneven from days underground, stubble lining a jaw that once belonged to boardrooms and field surveys rather than caves. His dark eyes carried intelligence dulled by exhaustion, but sharpened now by decision. "You still have Ortiz's contact?" Gideon asked quietly. Marcus nodded. "Encrypted channel. If I open it, they'll know I'm active." Gideon considered that and answered simply, "Good." Marcus blinked at him. "You want them to know?" "I want them watching the wrong direction," Gideon replied. He retrieved his laptop hardened, layered in security protocols, and placed it on the table. Ranger settled beside his leg, chin briefly touching his thigh, a grounding pressure that steadied the air. Marcus opened the case and revealed the drive, the sealed documents, the secondary flash drive taped beneath the lid. "Groundwater contamination. Illegal boundary expansion," he said softly. "The overlays don't match filed reports." Gideon nodded once. The scope was larger than pride. It was systemic. "You don't control what truth does," Gideon said. "Only whether you release it." Marcus inhaled deeply, as if bracing for a dive into cold water. "Then we release it." He began typing, hands steadier than they had been beneath the ridge. The encrypted route to Special Agent Daniel Ortiz activated slowly, lines of code moving across the screen. Gideon monitored traffic, rerouting signals through layered connections. Outside, wind moved across the lake in long sighs. Halfway through the upload, Ranger rose abruptly and walked toward the door. He did not bark. He did not tense. He simply stared at the wood as if sensing a shift beyond it. Gideon approached the window and parted the curtain slightly. A sheriff's cruiser idled at the end of the driveway, engine low and patient. The driver's door opened, and a broad-shouldered man stepped out, mid-40s, heavy build softened by long winters, thick mustache trimmed neatly above a mouth accustomed to issuing measured instructions. Sheriff Nathan Cole moved toward the cabin without haste, posture steady, not aggressive, but purposeful. Marcus's breath caught. "He told me to let it go," he whispered. Gideon glanced at the laptop 70%. "Keep going," he said quietly. The knock was firm, controlled. 3 even taps. Gideon opened the door partway. Cole's eyes flicked past him, taking in the room with trained economy. "Evening," he said, voice graveled by years of cold patrol nights. "Evening," Gideon replied evenly. Cole removed his hat as he stepped inside. Under the overhead light, his face revealed fatigue more than hostility, and faint lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of community meetings, domestic disputes, quiet compromises. He looked at Marcus. "You should have come to me," he said softly. "I did," Marcus answered. Cole's jaw tightened, acknowledging the truth without defending himself. His gaze shifted to the laptop. "You sending something?" "Yes," Marcus said. Silence pressed into the cabin. Thick, but not explosive. "You know what happens if that goes public," Cole murmured. "Yes." "And if it doesn't?" Marcus met his eyes. "Yes." Cole exhaled slowly. "My job is to keep this county stable." "At what cost?" Marcus asked. Cole's gaze sharpened briefly. "At the cost of collapse." The word lingered in the room like dust. Then Ranger stepped forward, calm, deliberate. He approached Cole and stopped just within reach, looking up without challenge. Cole hesitated, then lowered his hand instinctively. Ranger leaned lightly into his leg. Cole's composure fractured by degrees. Something softened in his eyes. "I had a shepherd once," he said quietly. "Lost him during a winter rescue my first year on patrol. Best partner I ever had." He swallowed. "They don't lie." The statement hung between them. Gideon watched closely. Cole straightened slowly and looked at Marcus again. "You're sending it anyway?" "Yes." Cole nodded once. "I won't stop you," he said. "I won't protect lies." He paused at the doorway. "But when this breaks, it breaks everything." Gideon met his gaze without flinching. "Sometimes it has to." Cole studied him, then stepped into the night. The cruiser engine started and rolled away down the drive. The upload reached completion seconds later. 100%. Marcus stared at the screen as if expecting it to reverse. "It's done," he whispered. Gideon closed the laptop slowly, deliberate as sealing a door. Outside, the mountain remained silent, indifferent to human decisions. The lake held the stars steady. Ranger returned to Gideon's side and sat, posture relaxed now, yet duty fulfilled. Marcus leaned back in the chair, tension draining from his shoulders, not in relief, but in inevitability. There would be consequences. Legal, economic, personal. Caleb Whitmore would respond. The town would fracture along fault lines no one wanted to see. But the truth had moved beyond the ridge, beyond the cave, beyond the mountain's shadow. Gideon stepped onto the porch and looked toward the dark outline of trees in the distance. He had come north intending to sign away inherited land, to reduce memory to paperwork. Instead, he had become custodian of something heavier than property. Behind him, Marcus sat in quiet disbelief, a man who had finally chosen action over fear. Ranger stood beside Gideon, sable fur barely visible against night, eyes steady on the horizon. The North did not cheer or condemn. It simply remained. The mountain had held its secrets long enough. Tonight, it had chosen to release one, and nothing that followed would be the same. In the end, the greatest miracle in this story was not the cave, not the hidden evidence, not even the collapse that changed everything. The miracle was quieter than that. It was the moment one man chose truth over fear. It was the loyalty of a dog who never questioned what was right. It was the unexpected mercy of a sheriff who decided not to stand in the way of justice. Sometimes God does not part seas or send fire from heaven. Sometimes he moves through small, steady choices. Through courage, when it would be easier to stay silent. Through loyalty, when it would be safer to walk away. In our everyday lives, we may never face a mountain or a conspiracy, but we face smaller versions of the same test. Do we protect comfort, or do we protect what is right? Do we stay quiet to keep the peace, or do we speak because truth matters? And if this story touched you, carry that courage into your own life. Share this message with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us what moment stayed with you. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking these journeys of faith, loyalty, and redemption together. May God bless you. May he protect your home. May he guide your decisions. And when your own mountain tests you, may he give you the strength to stand.